Hi everyone, Jason Kenney here. I'm doing a Facebook Live Q&A with you for the next hour or so, so please type your questions in the comment section below. And I just want Happy New Year first of all to everyone. While we are still going to be going through some challenging months ahead with the COVID pandemic and all that involves, thank goodness, as I say, we can see an end to this tough time. Thanks in part to the vaccines. And let me just say that we're making real progress on that. I'll have more to say this Friday, but we are already well ahead of the rest of the country in administering vaccines on a per-person basis. And we are continuing to pick up the pace on that and certainly hope that the federal government, which is responsible for procurement, will get us more vaccines more quickly so we can really turn the corner. I'm just going to go straight to your questions about whatever issues you guys have got to let you set the agenda here. Russ Stewart is first one up. Are you extending closures of gyms and in-person dining and other businesses that you have closed? Businesses deserve an answer. Thank you, Russ. I'll be speaking partly to this tomorrow. As you know, in late November, mid-November and then in mid-December, we announced new public health guidelines and measures to deal with a massive spike in COVID hospitalizations and fatalities that we saw coming out of the Thanksgiving in early October. And let me just pause to explain some context there. I've got here a chart which shows COVID hospitalizations in Alberta. And about here, that's first, second week of October, we had only 100 people in hospital with COVID. And as you can see, the line went almost straight up to 650 at about a month later, about mid-November. And now we've been at over 900 people in hospital with COVID pretty much consistently since then, usually with about 150 in ICU. We can manage that thanks to the great professionalism of our folks in the healthcare system, but we could not manage continued exponential growth, because once we were to hit like 2,000 or more COVID patients in hospitals, we have to cancel all surgeries that are not essential, with massive damage to other people's health. So tough measures had to be taken, sadly. And we said that the December measures that were brought into effect, I think on December 14, we would assess those a month later. And I'll have more to say about that tomorrow. Let me say that we obviously want to move to gradual relaxation and hopefully a return to a more regionalized approach as soon as the numbers are in the right space. But right now, Russ, we continue to lead the country in per capita new cases, active cases, and I believe fatalities, daily fatalities as well. Not overall, we're still lower than the national average since March, but on a day-to-day basis, we're ahead of other provinces. And so we are not in a position, we will not be in a position in the short term to relax the restrictions that were put in place, relax, I should say, all of the restrictions that were put in place in November, December. But I've made it clear in the past that we have to balance the public health imperative of COVID off against all of the other impacts of restrictions, and that will inform our decisions going forward. I'll have more to say about that at a news conference tomorrow. Bobby Rowe says, when will that recall legislation be going through? This upcoming winter session of the Legislature, the government will be introducing, and the Legislature will be passing Alberta's, I was going to say first, but actually second recall law. There actually was a recall law here in the 20s and 30s that was repealed. We committed to Albertans in the last election to consult with them through a legislative committee on the best design of a recall law, because I think there's only one other province that currently has one, that's British Columbia. They've had one since about 1990. And so that legislative committee on democratic reform reported to the legislature and the government, I believe just before Christmas. And so we're taking their report, their input, and drafting a bill that will be introduced. MLA Mark Smith from Drayton Valley, or Devon Drayton Valley, actually introduced a private member's bill on recall in the last sitting of the legislature, session of the legislature. And so we'll be we maybe bring back some of the elements of that bill. So there will be a recall bill passed this winter-spring session. Jennifer Madge, do you honestly think it's safe to send the kids back to school? Yes, Jennifer, and I'll be speaking to that tomorrow with Dr. Hinshaw, our Chief Medical Officer. Let's be clear about this. The schools have been operating in different ways around the world throughout the pandemic over 10 months, and there is a absolute scientific consensus based on that experience and data that the chances of children getting meaningful negative health impacts from COVID is statistically insignificant. And also younger children are much less likely to transmit. One thing that our data shows us from March to the end of 2020 is that transmission in the classroom followed, both from kindergarten to grade 12, it followed exactly the patterns of general community transmission, which tells us that having kids in a classroom in and of itself does not increase the chances of transmission. That if there is transmission, they're bringing in from outside the school, not in any meaningful sense transmitting within the school. We had very few cases, relatively, with I think over 700,000 students. We had relatively few cases of transmission within schools. And we will also be providing additional contact tracing support for where there are outbreaks in schools, and we'll also be providing additional support to teachers. More news on that to follow. We would not reopen the schools if we weren't certain that it was safe, as other jurisdictions around the world have found. Glenn Kerr says, what's going to happen to the ones who've taken days out of Alberta after we've been asked to stay put? Thank you, Glenn. So as you know, let me back up. Last week we learned that a number of MLAs and one minister and one senior member of my staff had traveled outside Canada during the Christmas holidays. And as I said on Friday last week, I take responsibility as a leader and as a premier for not having been absolutely clear that that was not acceptable. I have always told our team from the get-go that that we are, as elected people and people who hold positions of public trust, quite rightly held to a higher standard than that we demand or expect of people in the general public. And that standard was not met in this case. I made it clear to our colleagues repeatedly in the past 10 months that we had, in our own personal conduct, not to be perfect, because no one is, but to do our very best to demonstrate the highest level of conduct personally in compliance with both the letter and the spirit of COVID government restrictions and guidelines. And that clearly was not the case with the folks who traveled abroad. I am deeply, deeply disappointed, and I share the public anger. I hear people who've made huge sacrifices, people who've been away from their families, their loved ones for months, unable to visit elderly relatives, unable of grandparents to spend Christmas with their grandchildren, to hug their loved ones, to operate, in many cases, their businesses. Tens of thousands of people have lost their jobs because of all of this. The human cost has been devastating, and I hear Albertans with their anger. They are right to be angry with the decisions of those in positions of public trust who have traveled. And as the leader of the team, I restate that my responsibility never to let that happen again. That is why we had very serious disciplinary action on Monday when I announced the resignation of both Minister Allard and the departure from my office of my Chief of Staff, as well as the removal from government and legislative roles and responsibilities for other MLAs who had made a terrible mistake to travel abroad, a mistake that was insulting to many Albertans, which I deeply regret. I apologize as the leader of the team for the decisions that were made. And I have heard Albertans loud and clear. They expect not just a higher standard, they expect and demand humility and contrition and consequences. We've demonstrated the real consequences. We are changing our systems on this issue to ensure that people do not travel outside the province without getting approval. I mean, when I say people, who are elected within the government caucus or cabinet. We've also applied that to senior executives in the Alberta Public Service and agencies, boards, and commissions. None of that will take away the anger and the frustration, the feeling that there's been a double standard. As I said last Friday, ours is a government that has sought to support safe travel because the science tells us that people can travel safely, and it's essential that we keep as much of our economy operating as possible to keep people working. But none of that excuses the decisions that were made, for which I apologize, for which I deeply regret. And I hope that we can re-earn the trust of Albertans who are rightly ticked off with what happened. Wendy Lampkin says, why on earth would you move your office into the Sky Palace at this time? Very bad timing. Wendy, that's completely false reporting, I guess. Back in the beginning of the pandemic, we started to move all of the cabinet meetings and a lot of my daily briefings over. There's two buildings in the legislature, really. There's the old legislature building, which is actually pretty cramped quarters in terms of meeting rooms. We could not have COVID-safe meetings there. And then there's this newer building, the federal building. It was refurbished about 6-7 years ago. And there's much more meeting space. That's where I am right now. That's why we're doing our press conferences here. So all of our news conferences, all of these communication sessions, our cabinet meetings, our cabinet committee meetings, my briefings happen in these much larger spaces where we can space out in a COVID-safe way. So we started to do all of our meetings here back in March when the pandemic started for COVID protocol reasons. Also, there is basically an external reconstruction of the Alberta Legislature building that started around the same time in March, where there's jackhammers that have been operating right outside of my office. It's not possible to hold meetings or do events like this and Zoom calls and speeches while there's jackhammers blasting just outside my office. And thirdly, they had to build scaffolding right outside my office, which was a concern from the security team here at the legislature. So they advised that we move temporary offices over here to the federal building, and we're simply working, been working now since March, not recently, but since March, out of these offices. These are government offices that were empty, not being used, just set up as office workspace. That's where I've been working out of since March. Because of the construction happening down, the security issues as well. This is a much more, a better workspace for COVID rules. So that's why we've been over here since March. And I look forward to getting back to the main building as soon as we can. Courtney McLean says, where are you at with the equalization payment from Alberta to the east? Let me go back to the last question. Because maybe I understand, there might be a misunderstanding about Sky Palace. It is not a residence. I remember there was a plan to turn part of this building into a premier's residence. There is no residence, there's no bedrooms, there's no personal amenities. These are just offices. These are just boring government offices that we are using over here. And I guess some people are trying to turn us working out of government offices into some kind of a scandal. To be clear, the offices that are much nicer over in the old building. We've downgraded ourselves in terms of the size of these offices. This is not about fancy surroundings, just about getting the job done during COVID up here. Courtney McLean says, where are you at with the equalization payment from Alberta to the east? And also, how will you address the increased carbon tax? Thanks, Courtney. First of all, on equalization, we will be holding a referendum in Alberta, as we committed to Albertans this fall, in October, on equalization to get a mandate to renegotiate equalization and to let Albertans say whether that should even be a principle in the Canadian Constitution. So the details of that will be kind of forthcoming a little bit later this year. So we continue on that fight for fairness for Alberta in the Canadian Federation. And on the second question about carbon tax, so we are suing the federal government over the carbon tax. We won, as you might remember, in February of last year on a 4-to-1 vote of the Alberta Appeals Court on what we call our judicial reference on the constitutionality of the federal carbon tax, and they said it was a, quote, constitutional Trojan horse. So a very powerful decision in support of Alberta's view that the federal carbon tax is an unconstitutional intrusion into provincial authority. Now, that has been appealed by the feds to the Supreme Court of Canada. What are called oral arguments were heard, I think, back in September, and we are anticipating a decision to be rendered by the Supreme Court in the next 2 or 3 months. So we'll have to wait for that, and depending on which way that goes, determine our next steps. But we continue to fight it and use all of the legal means at our disposal. And I think, you know, I'll tell you this. When I used to say that the federal government and the NDP in Alberta intended to raise the carbon tax from $30 a ton to $200 a ton, I was mocked and ridiculed by a lot of the so-called smart people, by a lot of the pundits and media commentators, that I was making that up and that I was inventing an agenda. This confirms it, because the federal Liberal government has confirmed that they are moving the carbon tax from now $40 a ton to $170. And believe you me, they won't stop there. So we were right all along about how big this tax grab is, and it punishes resource-producing provinces and rural people in particular who consume more energy, who use more, farmers who use, who dry their grain, for example, an essential part of their work, greenhouse operators, and so much more, truckers, obviously. So that is why we are committed to that fight with our allies in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, Quebec, and New Brunswick. All right, Tyler Doucette says, with your concern about mental health being an issue during lockdowns, can you guarantee gyms and fitness facilities will be open back on the 12th? No, I regret that I cannot guarantee that, Tyler. I wish I could. And you're absolutely right that physical health is connected to mental health, and being able to exercise in gyms is an important part for many people of their physical health regime. I've been packing on the COVID pounds again since my gym was closed, and so I hear you, sir. But here's the deal: we still have over 900 people in hospital with COVID. We're losing very often 20 people a day as COVID fatalities. We are ahead of the country per capita on new cases, on total active cases, and on daily COVID-related fatalities. The huge spike that we saw in the fall, while the good news is it stopped going up, it's flatlined in terms of hospitalizations, but it has not come down. And so we are not in a position for a widespread relaxation of those restrictions, especially in areas that have been proven scientifically to be major vectors of transmission. We acknowledge the great responsibility of gym operators to try to reduce transmission. But at the end of the day, and I know, I hear what people say, and they're probably saying it right now on the Facebook, which is, how come I can go walk around in Costco with a lot of other people, but I can't go into my gym? Well, first of all, we've limited people that can go into grocery stores and retail to 15% of fire code capacity. Secondly, they all have to be wearing masks. And thirdly, they're not working out, doing aerobic activity, cardio activity, which naturally means that people are exhaling at a high level. What causes COVID-19 to be transmitted? It is droplet projectiles that people, when they're speaking, or especially if they're working out and breathing heavily with aerobic activity, those projectiles are what transmits COVID. And so it's sadly been proven that those environments can be serious vectors of transmission. It's a risk that we cannot take right now, but I do hope that we can get back to reopening the gyms and related activity as soon as it is safe to do so. Brian Savitsky, I think it is, says, do you think the public servants should take a cut in pay to share the pain of every other Albertan in private industry? Well, Brian, I think you ask a very fair question. Certainly, I've tried to lead by example. I took a 10% pay cut on top of an earlier 5% pay cut for Premier, and there's MLAs took a 5% pay cut in 2019 on top of an earlier 5% cut. So we're trying to lead by example amongst the elected people up here. Our political staff, those are the folks who kind of work in the legislature with the government, it took a 7% pay cut late last year, I think in November. So we're trying to lead at our level. But it is clear that the private sector has seen its wages and take-home pay go way down, and that's for the people who still have jobs. Of course, many have seen their pay go down 100% with unemployment. And so, as I've said before, we have a lot of great folks working in the public sector. We see that now clearly with the great people in the front lines of the healthcare system. But if we are all in this together, then we, all of us, including those of us who have job security in the government sector, I think need to demonstrate some shared sacrifice. So that will be reflected in the position the government takes in the collective bargaining on our major government union negotiations over the course of this year. I don't want to say much more because I'll probably run afoul of the requirement that the government negotiate in good faith. We're not allowed to talk about all the details, but I can tell you that our position is there must be shared sacrifice right across Alberta society. Those who enjoy the job security and the benefits of government work must recognize that the ability of the private sector to pay for that has shrunk significantly. The Alberta economy in 2014, our GDP was, I think, about $365 billion. And at the bottom of the COVID trough, actually before we got there, we had already fallen from $365 billion in GDP to about 300, and it had gone down by 10%. So gone down about $330 billion GDP. And then at the bottom of the COVID trough in like April, May, we were down to barely over $300 billion in GDP, a 20% evaporation of economic output from this province. That was not being felt by people in the government sector. It was felt almost exclusively by people in the private sector. And it still is felt by them. And so our message to the good people who we value that work in the government is that we can't squeeze infinitely more money out of a shrinking private sector to pay for folks who benefit from very strong job security and better benefits. So that fairness has to happen, and that is the position we are taking in collective bargaining. Glenn Wren says, is the Alberta pilot program going to continue as it has, or will we see changes due to the federal government? No, Glenn, it will continue, and Glenn's referring to the Alberta travel pilot, which is right now operating out of the Calgary International Airport and the Coutts land border crossing. We hope that next month it will be expanded to include the Edmonton Airport. And for those not aware, it allows arriving international passengers or travelers on the border, land border, to enroll in a voluntary pilot program where they get swabbed for a rapid test on site at the airport. They sign into the program. They must check in and do quarantine at home or wherever until they get the results of that first test back. If the results are negative, they're then allowed to leave isolation, but they must come back, I believe, after 7 days for a second test, just to be doubly sure. And the program's been working very well. We've had, I think, over 20,000 people have participated, and the positivity rate for the first test taken on the program has been 1.4%, which I think is a good thing. In other words, we've been helping to identify those people's illness earlier than would otherwise have been the case, meaning that we can intervene if we need to, provide health support, and make sure that they isolate the full 14 days. And we can also contact trace their close contacts, including the people they might have been sitting with on the airplane. So it actually makes a lot of sense. And that program will continue as an optional thing. But what Glenn's referring to is the feds, as of today, I guess January 7th, are also bringing, is it today the 7th? Yeah. They're also bringing in the requirement that people provide proof of a negative COVID test. I believe it is 3 days prior to boarding an aircraft to come back to Canada. And if they're coming from a country where that testing is not available, then they have to go into mandatory quarantine. And I know that's going to be a hassle for a lot of Canadians who are abroad, but frankly, I've been calling for this kind of thing since April or May. Because I do think we need to support safe travel in other places like Iceland, Austria, other countries that depend on tourism, brought in protocols like this a long time ago, which allowed for safe travel. So, and by the way, let me just say on this, I know a lot of people are ticked off about any travel, but there's a reason why we've always opposed any effort to, quotes, completely shut down air travel or travel generally. There is an advisory against non-essential travel. At the same time, the science is this. The Harvard University study and the U.S. Department of Defense study have both concluded that the chance of transmission on an airplane, with all the protocols being taken, mask wearing, sanitation, HEPA filters, and everything else, that the chance of transmission is statistically insignificant. It is lower than the chance of transmission doing normal daily activities like shopping in a grocery store. Now, you add on top of that a negative test before you can board the flight. You get a temperature test when you get on the flight. If you're an international arrivee, you have another temperature and test and a symptom screen as you go through customs with the Public Health Agency. And then if you're coming into the Calgary airport, you can enroll in the pilot and get another test on arrival, and then another test 7 days later. So we're talking there about 3 tests, mask wearing, temperature checks, symptom screening. I mean, I can think of very few things that are actually safer. People say, well, how come you can go and fly, but you can't visit your your friend's living room? The chances of transmission through social activity at people's private residence is massively, massively greater scientifically than that kind of safe travel. You don't get tested before you visited your friends, typically. You're not sitting there at the dining room table with your family wearing a mask. And you're not distancing 2 meters away and all the rest of that stuff. So the most common, by far, the most common means of transmission is sitting within 6 feet of somebody who's COVID positive for about 15 minutes or more, through exhaling these droplets. And so anyway, that's why at-home social transmission infinitely more likely to be a source of transmission than, for example, that kind of safe travel supported by all of these rules. Chelsea May Popow says, with overdose numbers so high, what is being done to help the population? Harm reduction, preventative information, mental health? Thank you, Chelsea. Thank you very much. Just before Christmas, you may recall that I released our new system for reporting drug and related substance abuse data. And I also released our third quarter report for drug-related overdoses. And what we have seen is that for the first 9 months of the year 2020, we had sadly seen over 1,000 people lost their lives due to drug overdoses, primarily opioid overdoses, which is a very significant increase. And so we've seen a significant increase in deaths over the normal year amongst younger men in particular, who tend to be hardest hit by this, and even more specifically amongst younger Indigenous men. And we believe there's a lot of reasons for that. Many of them are connected to the COVID response. We made in retrospect, a terrible mistake in March as we were rushing to impose COVID restrictions to keep people safe. We suspended residential drug treatment centers, which interrupted early stage treatment for many people with addiction. We suspended opioid replacement clinics from operating, which drove many people back onto the street for illegal drugs. And we also suspended the meetings of groups like Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous. So it's clear that those things, in addition to just the general stress the economic displacement, probably some of our Indigenous folks going from the cities where they had some support back to perhaps reserve communities where they didn't have some of that support initially. All of that together may have resulted in this significant increase. We're working with those First Nations. We have one of the big projects of this government, has been our mental health and addiction strategy. Chelsea, $145 million, a huge expansion, an increase of 4,000 treatment spaces in the system, eliminating fees for people to access publicly funded drug treatment centers, the construction of hundreds of new beds in what we call therapeutic communities that will allow people to get long-term recovery, not just an in-and-out 2-3 week program, but if necessary, months of support to really kick the habit and get away from bad influences in their life. We also added $53 million, I believe, in April, it was in June, for COVID-related mental health support, much of it being delivered by local community organizations, as well as things like the suicide hotline, the children's mental health line, and so much more. So, Chelsea, we're putting out a lot of additional support, much of it being delivered by great local charity and nonprofit organizations, creating more drug treatment spaces, and we did correct those mistakes back that were made in March. In April, we reopened the residential drug treatment operations, NA, AA, the opioid replacement programs, and so forth. And thankfully, since we've done so, we've seen the numbers start to come back down. They're still too high, but they're going in the third quarter of last year in the right direction. All right, Michelle Clark Pace says, is there any way to increase the daily vaccinations? Yes, thank you. Can't wait for our province to get back to work. Thank you for all your hard work. Thank you, Michelle. You're bang on. Vaccinations are just the key priority. That's where I'm focusing most of my time and energy. We have to get people's arms jabbed as much and as quickly as we possibly can. We cannot waste a day, an hour, a dose if it's all avoidable. And I will say this, in the first 10 days or so of Alberta's vaccine program, which started, I think, around the 15th, 16th of December, we were slower than I would have liked. I wasn't happy with that. AHS was holding back half of because remember, the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines that have been acquired and approved are both double-dose vaccine protocols with a 3 and 4 week gap between the first and second dose, respectively. So AHS, in what I would say was an excess of caution, was holding back half of the vaccines that they got to be sure to administer the second dose in 3 to 4 weeks. Well, I said to them last week, don't wait, just go and administer as many of those first doses as you can. We have to trust that the supply will come to provide for the second dose for those who have already been inoculated. And they had originally scheduled to take January 1st off. We said book it up, and they actually ended up doing, I think, 400 vaccines on New Year's Day. And we've caught up. In fact, we're now leading the country in terms of per capita vaccinations and the utilization of our stocks. In fact, I'll be speaking more to this at a news conference, I think, on Friday, but we are now if we don't get significant new supplies shortly through the federal vaccine procurement program, we may be running out of vaccine supply within a few days. That would be a terrible tragedy, but my instructions to AHS have been not to let the scarcity of supply to hold them back. We need to, frankly, stress test the system to inoculate as many people as we can on the priority list right now, as quickly as we can, partly because if and when we get adequate supply from the feds, we need to be prepared to be able to do 20,000 or more a day. I'm hoping to speak later this week to my good friend, Yuli Edelstein, who is the Minister of Health of Israel. I understand that they are vaccinating at a per capita rate that is 60 times higher, not 16, 60 times higher than Canada. And I want to learn from him how Israel's been so effective at doing that. We want to emulate as much as we can the sense of urgency and national mobilization behind the vaccination program in Israel, because ultimately that is how we get through this terrible time. All right, Susan Livingston Fank says, what are your thoughts on recent news that inmates at federal penitentiaries will be receiving vaccinations before many frontline workers? Yeah, Susan, that really, I found really a strange decision, disturbing decision. I kind of holding back a little bit here, Susan, because if, in fact, they're just going to be allowing elderly prisoners or those with multiple chronic health conditions who might be uniquely vulnerable to get priority access, I think that is fair and legitimate. These are people who live in, obviously, in pretty close quarters, and there can be a lot of transmission. So if you're dealing with a prisoner in their 70s or 80s who has multiple chronic conditions and maybe a very high health risk to COVID, I think there are legitimate health reasons, but absolutely would oppose, in no uncertain terms, prioritizing healthy young inmates ahead of the elderly and frail in our general population. That would be an insult, that would be outrageous, and I sure as heck hope that's not what's happening, and I will look into that. Again, I would just say elderly and frail, I don't care where they live, whether it's in long-term care or if they are in a penitentiary, there's a compelling health reason for them. But there's no way in heck that a healthy 20-year-old in prison should be ahead of a law-abiding 70-year-old with hypertension and dementia who's in the general population. That would be unethical. It would be an outrage. Just let me grab 1 second. Bit of water there. All right. Eric Mickelson says, are you going to take actual questions or just pre-planned ones? Why haven't you been available to the media to ask questions since Friday? Why are you hiding? Eric, I'm right here. I'm not hiding. And I did 2 news conferences last week. I did 2 the week before. I'm doing probably 2 news conferences right now. I'm taking questions from the public as I speak, and will continue to be accessible. And as you can see, I don't think yours was a pre-planned question. The way we work these things is when my schedule allows me to add in an hour or 90 minutes to do a Q&A on Facebook like this, which usually the day of, we make that decision. And then we let you folks know, and we just go live, and you can go and check and validate that every single question I've taken or am taking here are questions that people have written. I assume these are real bona fide people with real accounts. They're certainly not being generated by our staff or anything like that. These are questions and we try to get to a cross section, including questions like yours. All right, Charlene Hamilton says, do you plan to eliminate the war room? They are an embarrassment and far too expensive. Thank you, Charlene. So the war room is the Canadian Energy Centre. This is a commitment we made to Albertans in the last election. It was one of the most popular promises that we made to Albertans. I know that New Democrats and folks on the political left have never liked the idea of a concerted effort to stand up for the Alberta oil and gas industry, and that's fair. That's a reasonable position, but it's not the position that we were elected on. We were elected to have a much more concerted effort to respond to the campaign of lies that are being used to landlock Alberta energy, a campaign that has inflicted great economic pain on this province. So many people here who are unemployed, so many businesses that have gone under, so much opportunity that has been lost because of the constraints around Alberta energy, the lack of pipelines, and that lack of pipelines has been driven by a political and legal coordinated campaign to landlock our energy. And our government was elected to fight back against that, not to be passive victims in this campaign to attack Alberta's vital economic interest, to attack Alberta jobs. And that's why we ran in a commitment to create the Canadian Energy Centre with a $30 million budget. Now, let me put that in context. That's in a government with a $60 billion spending budget. So it is a tiny fraction of a tiny fraction of a percent of overall spending. Secondly, it is not new money, it's being reallocated from other areas. So the government before us did occasionally advertise. I think they had, I forget the exact number, I think it was $15 to $20 million in advertising for pro oil and gas advocacy. And we're just taking that budget, we've moved it to the Canadian Energy Centre budget, and instead of just doing that on an ad hoc basis, we're doing it in a much more continuous, professional, and strategic basis. Secondly, the industry is paying for it. So we have the Technology, Innovation, and Emissions Reduction Program, which is now basically a $40 per ton levy on major industrial emitters of CO2. That generates hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue. 10 million of that goes into the Canadian Energy Centre. So industry is paying a portion, the other portion is a reallocation from the government advertising budget. So it's not actually new money. Thirdly, when the pandemic started back in March, realizing that it was not the appropriate time to be doing a lot of advertising on the energy industry, we cut the budget of the Canadian Energy Centre by 90%, from 30 million to 3 million. And that has been supporting a lot of great research that they've been doing. I invite you to go to their website. Important research about how much wealth the industry has generated, government revenues to pay for healthcare, jobs that have been created in Indigenous communities, partnership with First Nations, environmental progress in reducing global greenhouse gas emissions from the Alberta energy industry, and important advocacy to support our industry's effort to get capital, to create jobs and invest in this province. Mistakes have been made, and our Minister of Energy is working with them to make sure they increase their effectiveness. As we emerge from the pandemic, we are going to need a strong platform to advocate for our largest industry, our largest job creator, and that will be their role. But their budget's been cut by 90%. All of that, in any event, is money that was being spent on pro-energy advocacy in the past. Sorry, folks, it's getting a little bit dry up here. Eric Martin says, where are we at with Alberta's own firearms officer and provincial police? On the firearms officer, you can expect some news on that in the very near future from we're completing not negotiations, but rather consultations, being led by a firearms advisory committee chaired by Brooks Medicine Hat MLA Michaela Glasgow, and it involves many representatives of the firearms owning community in Alberta to advise us on how best to structure an Alberta Chief Firearms Officer and how to challenge the federal regulations that were just introduced. So stay tuned for that fairly soon. On the provincial police, the Ministry of Justice and Solicitor General is doing a deep technical study on the costs, benefits, and potential structure of an Alberta provincial police force. We're expecting that study to be completed this spring for the government to look at the feasibility of that, what, if any, costs might be involved, so we can present that information to Albertans for a public discussion on it. I, for one, to be transparent, I used to be kind of skeptical about this idea maybe 5 and 10 years ago. I've really warmed to the idea. Partly because I really believe in the value, I think that was from Eric, of community policing. The RC, there's a lot of very good people in the RCMP. We honor their commitment, their service, and their history and traditions, and the policing work that they do in communities around Alberta. But one of the arguable drawbacks of the RCMP is that as a very complicated national police force with multiple different mandates, they're not necessarily best placed to do the kind of dedicated on-the-ground community policing that a provincial or local police force can. Edmonton, Calgary, Lethbridge, and some of our other communities in this province, I think there's 7 of them, have their own local police forces. And these are, the Edmonton Police Service is made up of Edmontonians, most of them born and raised here. And they know this community. They know the people in it. when they start their service, they're likely going to finish their career in the Edmonton Police. That is the backbone of community policing. But very often with the RCMP, you'll get folks showing up at a rural depot who might be from Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, or whatever, and they're there for maybe a 2 or 3 year posting, and then they're moved out to another posting, just as they've really started to get to know the community. They're often moved out, and so they don't have those roots, the local knowledge, the long-term view that is best in community policing. This is why the city of Surrey in British Columbia has decided to cancel its RCMP contract. It's a city of 600,000 people, and they're going with their own local police service. It's why Ontario, Quebec, Newfoundland, and Labrador have always had their own provincial police services. Alberta did in the 1920s till the mid-30s, and we think it's a legitimate idea worth looking at. And really, I want to hear from Albertans who are not served by their own local police service. What do they think about this? All right, Justin Mullis says, pardon me, how many people have fallen sick from the vaccine you keep pushing? Justin, I believe the answer is 0. In fact, I'm quite sure of that, because every day we report. Yeah, I'm getting confirmation. It has been 0. Wait, one. This is a news update I'm getting from my staff here. There's been one non-severe reaction reported. So we've administered over 30,000 vaccine doses. We have seen one reaction reported, but it was not severe. So in other words, something like 99.999% safe administration so far. And we are committed to reporting on any adverse reactions that we track from the vaccine program. Hey, Justin, let me be blunt. To those of you guys who are anti-vaccine, you have a right to be anti-vaccine. I happen to think you're wrong, and I happen to think it's unfortunate if we have some people who refuse to vaccinate with COVID-19, because for everybody who doesn't do that, we're increasing. Let me rephrase that. If there's a large number of people who refuse to take the COVID-19 vaccine, then that can jeopardize other people by increasing chances of general community transmission. So I think that's very unfortunate. And I would ask folks, Justin, like you, who are skeptical about vaccines in general, and this one in particular, to follow the science and the reporting. Both the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines went through the full course of trials, including their big phase 3 trials, which involved tens of thousands of subjects in the control groups, and they found no statistically significant number of adverse reactions and a very high level of efficacy. And Justin, if you don't, for whatever reason, you don't buy that, you're in those corners of the internet or whatever, which are vaccine skeptic. Hey, that's your call, sir. But please understand, we're not going to force you to take a vaccine. We're actually going to remove from the Public Health Act the power to compel inoculation that has been in the law in Alberta since 1910. So why do you need to attack other people who are taking the vaccines? Why attack the vaccine program? To those who are vaccine skeptics, I disagree with you, but please don't try to scare other people who are following the science and doing the responsible thing. I guess that would be my message. All right, Jennifer Taylor says, the whole world has a green plan and carbon pricing scheme. What's yours? Well, Jennifer, we have the Technology Innovation and Emissions Reduction Program that our government was elected on in our platform that has been implemented. Right now, it represents a $40 per ton levy on major industrial emitters who represent over 60% of the emissions generated by the Alberta economy. We believe that, and that fund, the revenues generated from that levy, go to support the investments in technology that actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Albertans generally do not believe that punishing people for leading normal lives in a big, cold, northern, modern economy is a responsible environmental policy. But that investing in technology is the key to continued progress in reducing emissions. And so we have a lot more than that, but that's the core, is the tier program. Just 1 second, please. Ali Johnson says, why is there a large amount of COVID vaccines in a freezer and not in people's arms? So Ali, actually, I maybe my team could get me the exact number right now. Last I saw, we had administered 56% of the vaccines in our inventory, and we may actually be running out of supply of inventory in some regions in the next few days, because our pace of inoculation is frankly outstripping the available supply. And now, so that's basically the answer. There's a shrinking number that are in storage. We're trying to get those out and into people's arms as quickly as possible. But I will tell you that we have the highest level of vaccination in Canada, I think, after Prince Edward Island. And we have utilized the largest percentage of a total available supply of all of the provinces, and we intend to continue to lead. All right, to Jay Rock, he says, oh, just been given an update. I said it was 56%. We've now as of because these numbers are changing by the hour, as of just now, we've crested past 65% utilization of our available supply. Jay Rock says, are there any plans being discussed to impose curfew here in Alberta? I've seen reports that Quebec and Ontario are looking into this. No, Jay, there have not been. This has never been advice that we received from the Chief Medical Officer. I just met with her and was briefed from her today. The answer is no. Rick Bowers says, what are you doing to regain the what are you doing to regain the trust of all Albertans after you've approved the vacation requests of the people in your government who traveled abroad? Well, thank you, Rick. Again, I learned about the fact that we had MLAs who traveled abroad last week when the situation in Ontario came to light. My office and our whip, who's basically the person that coordinates the caucus, started to reach out, and we found that there was one minister and I believe 4-5 MLAs who had traveled outside the country over the Christmas holidays. And I stood up on Friday in front of Albertans and I took responsibility for not having been clear enough, apparently, that this was totally wrong to do that. I had encouraged our team to do everything they could to live to a higher standard in full compliance with the letter and spirit of the COVID rules and guidelines. And I can tell you that our United Conservative Caucus whip had told MLAs that if they had any travel plans, he strongly urged them to cancel them and not to travel abroad. Sadly, a few people disregarded that, and I apologize for their conduct. They have been held to account for the decisions that they made. We did not approve their travel, and one of the things I'm learning from this is we need to be more disciplined. As I said last week, I'm not in the habit of tracking what the people who work with me do on their personal time, and it's never occurred to me that in a government we should be, telling members of the team what they do on their personal time. But it's clear to me that we have to change that. We now have put in place a system to require that people obtain approvals before they leave the province. I've made it clear that that applies not only to the elected people in government, but to senior public office holders generally, including senior executives in the Alberta Public Service. So we've put in place that system, and those people have been held to account, as you know, with resignations and demotions that were announced this Monday. Again, I understand your anger. You're right to be angry. Albertans are disappointed, and we must regain their trust. And that starts from the top. That's why I took responsibility for not having laid out an ironclad rule barring travel from elected people. That is now in place, and people have been held to account. And as a team, we have to learn to become more disciplined. I've already spoken to our government caucus about that, and that is a central challenge for us to demonstrate that we've learned from this and deeply regret the decisions that were made. Cynthia Ray Bush says, will Alberta be getting rid of the time change in the spring since BC, Yukon, Saskatchewan, and more are no longer changing back and forth? Cynthia, thank you. A good question. So that is a very real decision before the government. I'd like to know what you think. We did a consultation on this back a few months ago, and I think in the spring, summer, and it was like 85%, I believe, Alberta, over 80% certainly supported stopping the time change. And now that we see more jurisdictions in our part of North America, Alaska, BC, Washington State, I think maybe Oregon, and some others that are either looking at this or have done it, it would make more sense. It's difficult to be an outlier, but this is an issue that we may want to put to Albertans in a referendum this fall. That's what's happened before historically in Alberta, and it's not something that we ran on, so I'm a little bit reluctant to put that on, foist that on people through legislation without their consent, but let me know what you think. Should we have a referendum on that, or should we just go ahead and do that through legislation? Rebecca May Curtis, asks, why have you not updated Albertans on an exact date of when current restrictions and closures will be lifted? Will they be open as planned, or will we continue to be further restricted through January? Rebecca, I have an announcement on exactly that tomorrow, so please stay tuned. What we said in mid-December when the latest round of COVID-related restrictions were brought in because of the huge surge in cases in the fall was that they would be there for at least 4 weeks. We didn't say that we would be lifting them in 4 weeks. We said we would revisit the situation after 4 weeks to see how we were doing, especially with regard to hospitalizations. And look, the good news is this. Albertans have risen to the challenge in many ways. And we've seen the total number of active COVID cases come down pretty significantly from, I think, about 23,000 to about 13,400 now. So we've seen almost a 50% decline in the total number of active cases over roughly the past month. But the number of, this is hospitalizations, and I've shown this a couple of times, hospitalizations really have not come down. They've kind of flatlined, but we still have over 900 COVID patients in hospital, putting extreme stress, especially in our larger urban hospitals in intensive care. And we have to see those numbers come down. We also continue to have higher per capita levels of new daily cases, of total active cases, and I believe of daily COVID fatalities. So we are not out of the woods yet. And I think actually one of the worst things we could do at this point would be to put people back on a roller coaster of opening and closing, opening and closing. What I've heard from Albertans, they want off the roller coaster. I think the responsible course of action is for us to take gradual steps to relax restrictions, especially in areas which are unlikely to be cause transmission, to get back to a regional approach as soon as the numbers allow that, and then just to have a gradual, steady, predictable pathway to lighter restrictions and greater freedoms, as opposed to imagine if we were in this situation. We've still got over 900 people in hospital with COVID, some of the worst numbers in the country, to be blunt. Imagine, and we're still getting a positivity rate of 7%. Back in between, May and October, it was more like 1%. We thought a bad day was 1.5%. We're now consistently at 7% positivity rate. So imagine in that context, we were just to lift all the restrictions and let her rip. There's very little doubt, especially in the middle of the winter when people are inside. A virus like this is more virulent. You see other jurisdictions across the Northern Hemisphere, UK, California, Ontario, huge surges that are picking up right now. If in that context we were to broadly lift these restrictions, there's no doubt in my mind that we would end up back in the kind of exponential growth we saw in late November, early December. And that means these 900 COVID patients in hospital would, as the momentum picks up, become 1,800, become 3,600, and our healthcare system would be overwhelmed. I know there's a lot of folks out there. They haven't given me this question yet, but they're usually talking. You can find one. Find me a question on PCR testing, and I'll come to that, because a lot of people say this is all a case-demic. It's based on false positives on PCR testing. That's not what's driving our policy. What's driving our policy is the need to protect the healthcare system, prevent it from being overwhelmed, because for every additional COVID patient in a hospital, there is someone's surgery that we had to cancel. There are people we had to deny care, non-urgent care to. That creates its own healthcare crisis that is non-COVID related. If we were to allow exponential growth to return, we would see those numbers go back up, massive surgery cancellations, huge impact on other people's health, and then what? Ultimately, to prevent a total disaster, we would have to slam on the brakes all over again. And that business owners, for example, are telling me, please don't do that to us. The stress and the cost of starting up business again only to be shut down, as they've done in many other jurisdictions. We want to avoid that if we at all can. Michelle Pete says, are you opening up Alberta hockey for our kids again? Again, that's one of the things that we would certainly hope would be fairly early on the list, would be more outdoor activities. So please stay tuned on that. Tina Mary Pereira says, hello, Premier. What is Alberta's R value now? Are there any projections as to how close we are to seeing the number close to 0.8? Thank you, Tina. So the briefing I got today was our projection for the week of January 3rd was a province-wide R value of, I believe, 0.97%. I'm sorry, going to have to go back and check that. Actually, if I could just say to one of my staff, you can take a look at the briefing notes I had earlier today, so I can verify that for you. But I believe it's 0.97%. So unfortunately, we're not close to that 0.8% that we really need to be at for our public health folks to have the confidence for a more widespread reopening. We need to get more in that territory. You're quite right. But let me just add one kind of qualifier here, Tina. The data that we've got over the last week is frankly, well, it's just not reliable, because as we went through the holidays, the number of people being tested went down pretty dramatically. For obvious reasons, people were more staying at home. And so a lot fewer people were presenting themselves for testing. And we just don't know what that means yet. We have to see probably another week or so of data to really get a strong read on where we are with the RT, which is the inferred rate of transmission. All right, Mina Morrow says, Jason, you picked an interesting time to do this. Majority of Americans are watching CNN. Anyway, will you condemn... Sorry, it's really quite dry up here. Will you condemn this as well as the group that gathered in Red Deer today? Mina, I haven't seen what group gathered in Red Deer, but I know what you're talking about in Washington. And let me just say, as a friend of the United States, I am just pained to see what happened in Washington, D.C. today. There has been a lot of conflict and a growing amount of violence in the United States. Now, by the way, I should preface my remarks by saying, Mina, that generally I avoid commenting on the politics of foreign countries. It's not my business, and Alberta doesn't have a foreign policy. But I think what we saw today is truly, it crosses so many lines. And I do feel, as a leader of a province with very close ties to the United States, an obligation to speak out and up on this. And today we saw thugs breaking through police lines to basically try to effectively disrupt, through violence and intimidation, the functioning of a great democracy at probably the single most important moment in its democratic life, which is the formal, peaceful transition of power as a result of a democratic election. So I get it. There may be a lot of people who don't like how the U.S. election turned out, how the president that was chosen, Joe Biden. But in a democracy, the voters are not wrong. You respect the decision that they make. And what we saw today looked like banana republic tactics, not the traditions of a great republic. The United States isn't perfect, neither is Canada. But one of the reasons the United States has been an example to the world in so many ways, one of the reasons it's been a place that people from around the world have aspired to joining as a country, is because of its deep democratic values. And I'm sorry to go on about this, but I was quite emotional to see these stupid thugs violating one of the most sacred places and moments in not just American democracy, but world democracy. And shame on them. I hope those responsible have the book thrown at them. And I hope that the United States is able to proceed with the urgent and peaceful transition to power through the certification and inauguration of Joe Biden as the next president. Ricardo Francese says, what's the status of Keystone XL and Trans Mountain? What will we do with the Biden and the Democratic-controlled Senate? So Ricardo, first of all, Trans Mountain, I believe, is ahead of a schedule. I mean, look, it should have been done like years ago, but since the final legal impediments were cleared out of the way with the Supreme Court of Canada judgment last year, and since they were able to restart construction in earnest, they're actually ahead of schedule. There have been some glitches, as you would expect, and I think some safety issues that they're working through. But we continue to be cautiously optimistic about that. As more First Nations come on board, the British Columbia government has effectively dropped all of its opposition and continues to permit it. Keystone XL, we have a very strong strategy to reach out to the incoming Biden administration, together with the Government of Canada, and to communicate how the environmental performance of the Canadian oil sands and this pipeline proposal in particular have improved dramatically since many of the Democrats first heard about the initial KXL project a decade ago. A lot of things have changed. And I do appreciate, I clearly have a lot of differences with Prime Minister Trudeau's agenda, but on this, I appreciate that his Foreign Affairs Minister has said that Keystone XL and proceeding with its construction is the top bilateral priority of Canada with the United States as we move into the Biden administration. That's very important to convey to the U.S. that this is not only environmentally responsible, because even the U.S. State Department under Hillary Clinton concluded that moving this crude by pipe would produce far fewer emissions than moving them by rail, which is the alternative. That secondly, we have continued to reduce CO2 emissions and intensity in Canada. The federal government has a lot to say about that. Thirdly, that this is in the national security and vital economic interests of the United States. All the major construction building trades unions have signed up with TC Energy to work on the project. Thousands of jobs are being involved. We're creating facts on the ground with the project. So we'll be making a very strong case that this is essential. The incoming Biden administration respects and values its relationship with the most important economic, trading, and strategic partner of the United States, that we must go forward with this project. All right, Donna Stratton Tip says, I've read about the maker of the PCR test has stated it's about 50% wrong and wasn't designed for what we're using it for. Is that true? And then I actually asked for this to come up because I know there's a lot of folks, often when I check out the Facebook comments, there's a lot of this stuff about PCR. So PCR is the standard test for COVID-19 in Canada and Alberta and around the world. It's true that based on how many cycles the PCR test is does on a sample, that it can generate, and in many cases does generate, a false positive defined as a sample of an individual who may have what are called viral fragments, but who is not infectious or symptomatic. So there are, I'll call them COVID skeptics, who are claiming that all of the restrictive policies are being wrongly informed by exaggerated COVID case counts because of false positives through PCR testing. So, look, I'm not going to get into the super technical aspects of PCR, except to say that there is a reason why epidemiologists, scientists, public health experts across the world, including Dr. Fauci in the United States, who has spoken about the issue of false positives, but they all recognize this as the best available technology for testing COVID-19. That's not a political choice. That is a overwhelming scientific consensus. That's point one. Point two, in a sense, I mean, who really cares about the false positives? They don't. I acknowledge when we report our daily case count in Alberta, the cases are not all cases, or many of them are not actually people who are symptomatic or infectious. And so, all right, that they still should take responsible precautions and follow our self-isolation requirements and monitor their symptoms and avoid being in close contact with other people. That's just common sense. But folks, the data points, the metrics that really drive at least Alberta's policy response is not testing results. It has nothing to do with false positives. It's real people in real hospital beds. They're not false positives. That has nothing to do with PCR testing. Somebody who has to go in the hospital because they cannot breathe, somebody who's been so kind of knocked out by this disease that they can barely function, somebody who has to be intubated in an intensive care unit to avoid basically being unable to breathe. These are real people in real dire circumstances that require real medical care, that consume real healthcare resources, and that displace other patients, scheduled surgeries, non-urgent care. If you know somebody whose surgery has been postponed this year in Alberta, that's not because, well, it's granted, in the spring, we did open up a lot of dedicated COVID beds, partly through postponement of surgeries, frankly, preparing for a worst case scenario that thankfully did not arrive. But right now, these 900 plus people who are in hospital with COVID, these aren't fake PCR tests or false positives. They're real people. And if we look at that line and how it went up between October, November into December, if we did not take measures, impose additional restrictions, forget about the testing, we would end up with going from nearly 1,000 to 2,000 to 3,000 people in hospital. And those stories you heard about overflow, emergency, ambulatory tent hospitals, we would actually have to use those. So please understand, for those of you, look, I think there are absolutely legitimate grounds for critiquing how some of the data has been presented throughout COVID. I do think that using daily case numbers as defined by positive PCR tests as the core metric is not. I think that's a mistake, because there are a lot of people who are, that's not the most important data point, is what I'm trying to say. Most important data set point is how many end up in hospital, more particularly in ICU, and that's what's driven our concern. And I guess I should back up one step and say this: where the PCR testing is I think, most useful for us is this. It's an indication of where things are going, because there's about a 3-week lag between somebody becoming infected and possibly being hospitalized. And this is very interesting. While the infection fatality rate has come down quite significantly since last spring, which is a good thing, more effective medical interventions and a lot of other reasons for that. That's good. But the case hospitalization rate has not come down. So that is to say, the ratio of positive PCR tests to the number of people who end up in hospitals has stayed consistent, meaning that for planning purposes and policy purposes, we can draw pretty reasonable inferences about where the pressure in the healthcare system is going 2, 3, 4 weeks from now, based on how many people are testing positive today. So it actually still is useful in that respect. Jason LaFrance says, as a teacher who's trying to plan my life and my work, can you give us any more information about whether or not students will go back to classes on Monday? Jason, I will have an announcement on that tomorrow. Please stay tuned. And thank you, as a teacher, to you and all of your colleagues for what you do. As you know, we had said that it's our intention to reopen in-classroom instruction from K to 12 on January the 11th. I'll be making a statement about that tomorrow. Denise Williams-Bouteau says, after the missteps by the UCP government caucus, how are you going to show you're actually listening to us? Well, as I said, thank you, Denise, for that question, and you're right to ask that. As I said, we demonstrated that we're listening by showing real consequences for those irresponsible decisions and actions. People have been removed from their jobs. Significant disciplinary action has been taken. We've also adopted a new protocol that requires that elected members of the government caucus, cabinet, that political staff, and that senior members of the Alberta Public Service must seek approval. Well, they are not to travel abroad for personal reasons, period, and must seek approval for any essential business travel, which I don't see any reason for. And it's going to take us time, but we need to demonstrate that we've learned these lessons, that we've heard Albertans in our conduct. Let me say this, that we started as a government demonstrating leadership by example. I took a 10% pay cut on top of a 5% cut that a previous premier had taken. MLAs are paid 10% less than they were a few years back. Political staff around here took a 7% pay cut. So we acknowledge the tough times that people were going through before COVID in those symbolic actions, and we need to get back to that spirit and demonstrate in personal conduct that, as I said at the beginning of COVID, nobody's going to be perfect, but a higher standard is rightly expected and demanded, and Albertans are absolutely right to be ticked off. And once again, let me be clear, I apologize. I apologize for the team, the government, the United Conservative Caucus, for the decisions that were made, and I hope that we can re-earn the trust of Albertans in the months to come. With that, I've been at this for well over an hour, I gather, so I think I'm going to wrap it up. I've got to get to other things now, but thank you very much to those of you who have asked good questions, and I hope now that we're back in the new year to get back into the cycle of doing these about once a week or so. So if I didn't get to your question this time, let's try again next week. Thanks very much, and all the best for 2021.